this presentation and in our discussion, we see this term NPDES. And this is what it stands for, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And it's part of the Clean Water Act that was passed. And it applies to the permits that we are going to be discussing. Surface water. What is surface water? Surface water is the water that runs across the surface of the ground, down the street, down the gutters, down the drain. It comes from where? Rain. It comes from leaky pipes. It comes from irrigation. That's surface water. What we're concerned about is what's called groundwater. And that's water that's in the ground. It moves through the various layers of the ground. It collects in aquifers. It's what we're concerned about. And it's what's known as the water table. So when you hear about, oh, the water table's high, the water table's low, it depends on where you are, depends on the soil conditions, depends on all kinds of things. But that's what we're concerned about, is that water that's in the ground called groundwater. Okay. Where we are is that our facility was built to remove that groundwater and prevent it from compromising the integrity of our foundation. And we remove it and pump it into San Diego Bay. And that's what we've been doing ever since the building has been opened. So now we find out that going forward, if we want to continue to discharge into San Diego Bay, we must build and operate an on-site water treatment plant at significant cost. We have to operate that at some significant cost in the years ahead. And we have to treat water that we didn't create and we don't use. It's not water we want, it's water we want to get rid of. We have to remove toxins from that water and get it to a certain level of purity that it can be discharged into a public water like San Diego Bay. We didn't put those toxins in the water, they just are in the water. But if we don't do this, and we don't get a permit to discharge in the bay, and we continue to discharge without a permit, we're liable to very substantial daily fines. So we're stuck. Okay, is that fair? We all can say, take a vote on that? No, it's not fair. We know it's not fair. Okay.
So what's the origin of that requirement? What is the origin of that requirement?
We'll talk about that. Okay. So basically, we're in agreement. It's not fair. It's not something we want to do. It's not something we plan to do. It's not our fault. But here we are. So let's look at a little bit of the past history that Tom and Pete and the city have put together from records that are incomplete. And it's what it is. But it does, it's just to give you a sense of how long this has been going on. This particular issue has been building. And basically, we got a permit to build the structures back in the early 80s. And our particular building permit was issued in 1990. And the initial San Diego Bay permit process started in around 1995. Okay, so the process that we're talking about started back in 1995, and it's a process where you issue permits on a 5-year basis. And they're for Clean Water Act, as I said, and it's for people who discharge into San Diego Bay or other bodies of water. But that's the one we're concerned about. And there's an organization called the Regional Water Quality Control Board that we deal with. And in 2013, they surveyed the bay and they noticed that there was a discharge out in Centennial Park. And so they directed the city of Coronado, find out where that discharge is coming from. And we all know where that discharge is coming from. It's coming from us. That's part of the design of the original building and permit. So it's no secret. We're not trying to hide that fact, but that's where it was coming from. So in 2014, the city identified Coronado Point as a source of that discharge to the Water Quality Control Board. And there are a bunch of discussions and so on that were going on. And it appeared that the city and Coronado Point had agreed with the Water Quality Control Board that we should be part of the permit that was to be issued in the 2015-2016 timeframe. Well, that didn't happen for some reason. We didn't get on the permit, but we were allowed to keep discharging into the bay. So to us, nothing happened of any significance at that point, but it sort of, we started thinking about this, and the boards back then, C.O.A and others, they were aware of this and kept an eye on it. But in 2020, the 2015 permit expires, and so the process to renew the permit started, and Coronado Point was advised at that time, hey, this time you're definitely going to need to get on the permit. And the permit is going to require you to clean up that water if you are going to continue to discharge into the bay. So COVID kind of pushed that process back a couple of years. So now our schedule is to permit in 2023. So let's talk about that. We'll get there in a minute. So why do we have to discharge our groundwater? Well, when a building is close to or possibly below the water table, the groundwater can push up against the foundation of the building, hydrostatic pressure against the building structure. And so this water has to be removed if you're going to retain the integrity of the building structure. And we know it will do that because in the past, I didn't live here, but I've been told by residents, early residents here, that in fact, the foundational structure was cracked by hydrostatic pressure coming to groundwater. And this led to some mitigation measures where they put in some additional pumps and drains or whatever around the building to try to remove more of this groundwater. And that appears to solve that particular problem. So we have a series of sump pumps, we have French drains, and we monitor that situation. We even have those pressure plates in the garage that are supposed to pop up and relieve hydrostatic pressure if it becomes too great. And in the past, they would pop up and regularly. So the measures that they put into place to take care of that early buckling, cracking, appears to have solved the problem to the degree that the pressure plates have not popped up in some time, which is good. That's the way the system is supposed to work. That's the way the building was designed. Relieve that pressure and preserve the integrity of the foundation. But we have to put that, discharge that water and put it somewhere. And we're talking about not, here's a tank, put it in the tank and say, no, this is enough water that we have to continually discharge. There's no way to retain it somewhere. Okay. So what's this process? Where are we going right now? I'm going to show you two slides. The first is the bureaucratic water quality control, the permit process itself. And so this particular slide, as you can see, you've got all this stuff on the left. You don't have to worry about that. The numbers and the color codes are not significant at this point. But I have 4 arrows up here that indicate a couple of key dates that are coming up. One of them is in December here. This is a board meeting where the staff of the Water Quality Control Board is going to put out a draft permit. A number of draft permits, because there are a number of different applicants that have different kinds of permits. But they put those out for the stakeholders, i.e. us, to comment on the permit. Then down here, they're going to take our comments and make whatever changes they feel are necessary and put it out again for a more public, for the public to look at the permits and comment on them. And then the full board. So this is the first time we hear what the full board is going to have to say. And that comes back in March timeframe. So this is the first time we've been in front of the full board to hear what they have to say about that particular permit. And then this time frame down in April, May is when we expect that permit. It's a funny process and funny words, but they call it an application that will be issued. And that's basically our permit. Time for us to have a permit in place is that time frame. So that's the time frame we're talking about. So as part of that, we have to build a plan. Okay. A water treatment facility on Coronado Point. Well, this particular chart shows some of the main points that I want to make in that particular. We have the vertical red line shows where we are now, but the blue arrows are some of the key points that are coming up soon. The first one being that we want to put out our bids. And we want to do that in late November, early December. Put out our bids to build this facility. And then we want to award a contract in early January and get started. And have it up and running in March, April timeframe. Well, that sounds pretty quick. It's only 2-3 months. So, but that's basically the plan in order to have it up and running so that we can in fact say we're ready for the permit and qualify for the permit. We have to demonstrate that we can do what's necessary to treat the water before discharging it into the same. Okay, what are we constructing? Well, this is a conceptual diagram. You can see individual sump pumps. We collect what the sump pumps now send out to San Diego Bay. We collect it internally and we put it into tanks to mix and store, that you take water out of the tanks, it goes through a bunch of different equipment and systems that treat this particular water and remove the toxins. Then it goes through flow meters, and so on, and out to the bay. Well, what does this look like? Well, this is a plan view. Looking from above, this is what it looks like. It's a bunch of tanks, a bunch of equipment, a bunch of pipes. But the interesting thing is, it's sized to what we have to do, our quantity of water that we are discharging, and the two toxins that we have to remove.
How much water are we discharging?
How much water are we discharging?
About 7 to 10 gallons a minute, about 14,000 gallons a day.
7 to 10 gallons a minute.
14,400 a day.
14,000 gallons a day.
Where would
Roughly.
this equipment be located?
Roughly. Now, it gets to that. So what I want to point out here is, this is a nice diagram, so it's stuck in it. So what I want you to see is, it fits in a box 20 feet by 15 feet. 20 feet by 15 feet. That's the main thing. Now, there's piping all in here too, and piping coming from it to go into the necessary pipes that we already have in the garage. Where's it going? Well, here's where we're planning to put it. It takes up 3 parking spots in visitor parking. Right there. 3 parking spots. 15 by 20 by 875. That's where we plan to put it. All right. We can't do this on our own. I don't think any of us, board of directors, owners, this is not something we know how to do. I mean, really, this is a very particular area of the law, particular area of the rules, and we deal with entities that we don't normally deal with. And so consequently, we needed to have consultants and help. And you'll see those on the left side of this particular chart. Shepherd Mullen is a law firm in the Bay Area, and we have a very competent expert in the area, Keith Garner, who's our legal advisor. And we have ALG Group here, Ashworth Leninger, and Apex Engineering. So they will be the ones that are going to be working primarily here in the future in constructing our treatment plant and getting it up and running. But the other entities around Coronado Point, like the city and the Regional Quality Control Board, San Diego, and all of those, these are people that we've interfaced routinely on this particular project. And I must say that all of these people have been very supportive and helpful in getting us through that. They recognize our unique situation. And it is unique, no question about it. If there's anybody else on Coronado that's applying for a permit, residential. In fact, there are very few public entities that are going after this particular type of a permit. And we know of one other that's in San Diego, and it's a office building. It's a big office building. So they understand where we are and where we're coming from. I mean, some of these people are discharging enormous amounts of water, and we're not even in that ballgame. I mean, we're just this little tiny 2,000 gallons. That's a speck to some of these people. So I have to point out, though, that the Coronado group, particularly Tom and Pete, have worked tirelessly on this particular project, and it has not been an easy one at all. because it's so different and we have so little experience in the area. We're very fortunate to have really good advisors. Okay. So before we go on to the next session, which is questions and discussions, I'm going to pick up and move over to the table. And how many people do we have? 3. Okay. I have a couple of things I want to point out before I get going. And that is that the way we will take questions is if you raise your hand, Kirk will bring a handheld mic over so that we can get it properly mic'd, particularly for the people at home. Okay. So in the Zoom attendees people, what we want them to do is continue to mute. We're not going to take verbal questions from the Zoomers. And they should, if they wish, they should just delete their video because there's nothing really for them to see there, or we don't need to see them. But use your chat box and write out your questions. Okay, I think that's it. We're going to go back and forth. If there are questions from the Zoomers, we'll go back and forth and weave them into the questions that we have here. Okay, that's my presentation. I'm going to go sit down at the table and you're going to take this mic out of my hand.
Do we have a Zoom question? Do we have a Zoom? No. Okay, first question, Jerry.
Yes, I'm Jerry Runner, Unit 407. And one thing that looks to me like you're just acquiescing to go, I would like to see side by side a material list, or what do we call it, of what we are discharging and what is the city or whatever organization is the county requiring of us to be better than. And I haven't seen any of that. It is, we're just going to go do this now. We're not going to fight it. And, you know, it could be that we could do this less expensively, by removing some of the particles or whatever. Anyway, that's my question. Why don't we have it? Why don't we have it up here for us to see?
Okay, is the question understood? You can answer.
Yeah, let me try first and then we'll see where we go from here. So we have done extensive testing on multiple occasions beginning back in 2015. And what we've found consistently is that we're over the limits on 2.
We don't know what we're over the limit. We don't know.
Okay, well, I'm about to tell you.
Huh?
I'm about to tell you.
I don't want to, I want to see it.
Okay, I can send you a copy of the reports.
Well, why didn't you show it to us in this presentation?
Well, there's several pages long.
What?
There's several pages long, as I recall.
It's a zip file.
It's about 50 pages of very dense data. But what it boils down to is that we have excess amounts of copper and a chemical called PCE. And the copper is easy to understand. The copper's in the bay, the PCE is in the bay. But the problem is that once those become in our possession, we have to filter them out before we're allowed to put that water back into the bay, even though it's
No, I understand.
chemically very, very similar to the water that's in the bay. So we're going to be filtering for those 2 items. We're going to be filtering just enough to get them down to the levels that are acceptable.
Thank you.
have to filter, you know, you can't go in and some method of extracting the copper and whatever this other thing is, without going through the making of a whole processing plant.
Unfortunately not. Yeah, that's a great question. Couldn't we just put an inline filter in every single one of these pumps that we have that's pumping water out? And wouldn't that just solve the problem? But the problem is more difficult than that, because what we're measuring here are parts per billion. They're not even parts per million. I had a joking conversation with a member of the Water Quality Control Board staff the other day, because we're trying to argue that we should be able to have a different standard because our usage is so low. We actually have to meet the standard for 100,000 gallons a day, even though we're only pumping 14,000 gallons a day. And the reason is because there is no lower standard. And we're saying, well, we're such a small part of this. Can't we have a lower standard? But the fact is that we have to meet this parts per billion requirement. And in order to filter to a level of this small.
What is the city council doing to help you on this? Can't they?
Jerry, these are different questions, and I know you want to go from question to question, but if I can, let me finish this first one first. Since we have to filter to these very small amounts, unfortunately, we have to use very sophisticated filtering equipment. We have to be able to test the water immediately afterwards because we have to consistently give our test data back to the Water Quality Control Board, proving that we're meeting the standards. So if we had to test in each individual pump area, that would greatly increase the amount of testing that we would have to do, even though I've already told you that we really can't filter to that level with just a standard inline filter. It's got to be the sophisticated filtering system. So that's why we have to bring all the water to one point, filter it all at one time, and then be able to test immediately afterwards.
I mentioned it's a federal statute we're trying to comply with.
It is a federal statute. This is a law that was put in place, I want to say, under Clinton. Not even Reagan.
1970.
Okay, this is an interesting conversation. I'm sure there's going to be another question.
Yeah, well, thank you for this meeting. It's extremely well organized and I appreciate the slides and the opportunity to comment. Do we as an organization have the opportunity to present these comments when it goes to the staff of the Regional Quality Control Board and tell them our situation, why we're the only one in Coronado? You mentioned that meeting's coming up, and so if we can develop our comments beforehand, I think that would be great.
Who would like to respond to that, Pete? Tom?
The meetings that are held monthly are with the staff of the Regional Water Board. And I'm going to back up a bit and give you a brief history of time here. The controlling statute is the Clean Water Act of 1972, which governs all waters under the jurisdiction of the United States. Mostly navigable waters, but there have been some others thrown in. Because the bay is navigable, it's included. The Clean Water Act created regional water boards. There are several in California. San Diego area has one. When they were created in 1990, the board for the San Diego region had issued an order saying that they were going to permit discharges into the bay, and they have various types of permits. One is called a general permit, which involves us. The first permit was issued in 1995. To be considered grandfathered on that permit, you had to be permitted for construction prior to 1990. When the permit issued, there were three entities listed as grandfathered. One was the Embassy Suites, one was One America Plaza, and the third one was the Convention Center, City of San Diego. Over time, the Convention Center got its own permit. Embassy Suites disappeared. I have no idea what they did. One America Plaza is the only grandfathered entity that's currently listed on the permit. So now you have to distinguish between being on the permit and what we're doing because we're on the permit. So currently, you cannot discharge groundwater into the bay, period, unless you're on a permit. And to be on a permit, in this case, you'd have to be grandfathered. So a lot of the efforts that we're directing are being considered as a grandfathered entity that should be authorized to discharge into the bay. So issue number one is getting on the permit. In order to discharge into the bay, you're required to meet certain standards of the quality of the water. Okay, and there is a laundry list of contaminants, I'm gonna say it's in the dozens that you have to test for. We have two that were over the limit, as Pete had said, that we would have to filter out before we could discharge under the permit. The issue that we have, I don't think we would or could contest the level of contaminants. The effort that I think would be potentially worthwhile is the one that Pete mentioned, it's frequency. So if we meet the standard and we discharge these 14,000 gallons a day and other people are in the tens or hundreds of thousands of gallons, would it make sense to have a lower frequency of monitoring? The monitoring frequency is determined by the contaminant. The two that we have are indicated for quarter. A quarterly test run $5,000 to $15,000, depending. It would be beneficial to us if we could be considered for a lesser frequency of monitoring, but it would not change the requirement that we filter those contaminants out. So separating those issues, our efforts right now are to get listed on the permit. And the slide that Philip showed on the permitting process indicates we've been working. I think I lost you. The board that we've been working with is the staff supporting the regional water board. We have not met with them. We have not had a meeting with the regional water board. We've only met with the staff. It's similar to the city council. You know, when the water board meets, they get recommendations from the staff. The staff has done the work. They're reviewing a report. They're not going over the detail of our consideration. So the permitting process would involve a series of meetings with the staff. And we have started to bring up the issue of frequency of monitoring. And we can go into that in some detail later if Phil wants to. As far as the city is concerned, this was on one of the slides. The city was directed in 2013 by the Regional Water Board to identify the source of the discharge in the Centennial Bay outfall. That's that pipe. Go to the end and look, it sticks out and you can see sometimes stuff coming out. They did that. They were under an order to do it. They did it. It was us. Obviously, we had it. We discharged from the time that we were built. When the city identified the discharge as us, they indicated that we should be listed on the permit. There was a consideration of how do you do that? And one is get listed on the permit issued in 2015. The letters started in 2016. There was some thought they would put us on an amendment. Amendments are time consuming evidently and complex. So it was decided that it would wait until the 2020 permit issue. Well, these are issued on 5-year periods. The period is somewhat flexible because things come up. 2020 permit was delayed by COVID and a number of other things, still hasn't issued, probably issued in 23. The city at the time, this is 2016, 2017, sent to the water board. We've identified Coronado Point as a discharger. They should be listed on the permit. The city did extensive research into the special use permit and the building permit that was issued for the Landing, Centennial Park, and Coronado Point. And the reason they did that was to validate that we should have been included in the original 1995 permit as a grandfather discharge. The city also said that they did not approve going to the sewer for a couple of reasons. One was the volume at the time, and the other were the contaminants. And their position at the time, and I think still is, if we discharge the sewer, we would have to meet the standards of their permit. Everybody that discharges to the bay is under a permit. There's a municipal permit called an MS4. And Coronado is covered under one of those, it's multi-jurisdictional. But they have to meet a certain standard, and their position has been, if we put it into the sewer, it would have to meet that standard before we could put it in. So you'd be subject to filtering and testing and sewer charges. So their position is this is actually better for us. That make you feel good?
Thank you. I want to give you a chance to take a deep breath. Would you like to add anything, or Pete, would you like to add anything? Okay, the next question.
How much does it cost?
Hi, thank you for having this meeting, and thank you, Tom and Pete and Philip, for all your time and hard work you put in on this. I originally had a question about the timeline involved in between 2015, 2016, and then 2020, but Tom just appropriately and accurately indicated why that happened. So I guess rather than a question, I got basically a comment. It's just really unfortunate that we didn't do this way back when it was going to be a hell of a lot cheaper than it is now. We're in an inflationary environment, 8 or 9% or whatever it is, and it's certainly going to be a hell of a lot more costly now than it would have been. And the only other comment I had is I've been involved in various committees and on the board and whatever between 2017 and say 2019, and I never had heard of anything involved in this whatsoever. So it's just basically a comment and basically a surprise to me that this has come up pretty much out of the blue, especially having been involved in various committees and the board.
Okay, thank you. That was not a question, that was a comment. Would anyone like to respond to the comment?
Yeah, I'll just respond to the last part, and I certainly understand that question. So when this originally came up, the city basically acted as a liaison between us and the Water Quality Control Board. And so for a variety of reasons, most of our interaction was with the city at that particular time. I had a few phone call conversations with members of the staff at the Water Quality Control Board, but they required a few things of us, one of which being a fairly extensive set of tests, which we provided. And at some particular point, they stopped contacting us. And so, Claude and I consulted at that particular time and said, well, this is going to be an expensive process. And maybe they've decided that because there's so little water from us or for whatever reasons that they don't need to bother with us anymore. There's also some question at some point about whether or not the changes that had happened on a federal level in terms of who was now in charge of the EPA or whatever else may have somehow taken the pressure off. But either way, they weren't getting back to us and requiring anything more from us after we submitted those tests. So the issue went to sleep for several years, didn't wake up again until 2020. So if it wasn't a topic in board meetings during that period of time, that's why. There was really nothing happening.
Thank you. Would anyone else at the table like to respond? Okay, do we have a Zoom question? Okay,
We have a question.
Marshall.
okay, Marshall, I'll get over to you. Next question.
Hi, I have a couple questions. Philip, in your summary this morning, which also was in the slide that you sent out to all of us, it said that in 2014, the city identified CP as the source of the groundwater, discharge. And who did they notify at Coronado Point that this was an issue? Because I'm a little confused about the timeline, because it says that there was a lot of discussion back and forth, and Pete, you just said that you were notified, but then they stopped notifying you. And, I was the one who asked the question about why weren't we notified as potential homeowners that this was an issue prior to buying our homes. So I'm a little bit confused about the timeline, particularly about, saying that this was known, but I think you just said you didn't know anything about it.
Never
In
heard
the
of it.
board.
Never heard of it.
So I don't understand this.
Well, like I said, we weren't really entirely sure what this was all going to mean. be honest with you, our arguments at that particular point were among the same kind of arguments that we're hearing from the room now, which is we shouldn't have to be part of this process. What we're doing predates all of these requirements and et cetera, et cetera. There's not a lot of volume. There's not a lot of, we're just barely over the limits. So we weren't entirely sure that this was ever going to come back.
So when you say we, do you mean the management company or was it the board?
Well, primarily Claude, Pickett, and I were the ones that were meeting with the city at that particular time. And we were reporting back to the board of directors when we met with the city. So there were times and places that we met with the city early on. But like I said, those meetings were mostly stimulated because the city would contact us to say, we've got a problem, we need to resolve it. And so we'd sit down and work with them and provide whatever data it was that they were looking for at that particular point in time. But when the city stopped contacting us, we didn't really have anything further to do with it.
So you just then decided since they stopped contacting you that it was no longer an issue.
Yeah. What you see.
And also, I thought he said that he hadn't heard anything about it at the board. You
Well,
just
I
said-
had, so I think I heard something about it at some point. I had knowledge of this and I've never been on the board till 2000.
It was very unclear about what was going to be required, what would end up, what our responsibilities would end up being. There just wasn't a whole lot of information. When they stopped pursuing it, for a period of years, it wasn't like they stopped pursuing it for a period of weeks. This really disappeared off of everybody's radar screen at that particular time. But if you would have asked me back in 2015, 2016, what did I think was going to end up happening with this? Nobody could have told you. We just didn't have any concept of what might be required here.
Okay, next question, Marshall.
So do I understand that the requirement is only for our project on the whole island?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm going to start out trying to answer it if you gentlemen don't mind. We'll move from there. So when the original permit was issued back in 95-ish, there were 3 parties to that permit. Now you have to understand this isn't a Coronado Island permit. It's a San Diego Bay issue. And in the entirety of San Diego Bay, there were 3 participants in that permit. Tom mentioned them. One was the Embassy Suites, one was One America Plaza, one was the Convention Center. So those were the 3. If it was complete, we would have been a 4th member of that permit at that time. But for some reason, nobody identified us as being a problem during that period of time, and so it didn't happen. But of those 3 constituents that were on that original permit, 2 have now dropped off. Only 1 remains, and that's One America Plaza. I'll note, and I meant to bring this up earlier when Philip was doing his original introduction here. The team that we have working for us is the same team that works for One America Plaza, from the attorney all the way down to the engineers and everybody in between. And so over the years, that hasn't always been true. There have been different experts that we've worked with at different periods of time. But we believe that at this particular point, we have the team working with us that is absolutely the only subject matter expert on this particular permit at this particular time. So are we the only discharger into the bay? No, at this particular point, there's at least 1 other discharger that's identified. And these are permanent discharges, by the way. One American Plaza, as well as ourselves, discharge constantly. There are other people who will be involved with this permit or other projects that could potentially be involved in this project intermittently. And those would be maybe a construction project that might take place or something like that, where they will be discharging for a finite period of time. And so this permit would also apply to them. It's a pretty broad set of instructions, I guess, for anybody who's going to be discharging into the bay.
Thank you. Any further comment from the table? Next question, right? Tom, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Marshall, if part of your question is, are we the only ones in Coronado that are affected? To our knowledge, yes. And the issue is pumping groundwater. It's not discharging to the bay. The groundwater that we pump through the sump pumps is a small part of what we discharge to the bay, because when it rains, all that water that comes down goes into our drains, that goes into the bay. You see the storm drains on the street, that goes into the bay. That's not covered by the permit. What makes us unique is that we pump the water and put it into the bay. If that water just flowed into the bay, if there was no building there, it would be a non-issue. The act of pumping is what makes it our responsibility.
Any further comment from the head table? Pete? No? Dan Berger?
Hi. Has anybody explored if we qualify for any type of grant?
That's a good question, and I'm not aware of any grants that are available for this, and the answer would be no.
I believe we have another question right here.
You haven't discussed all the costs, and that was Marshall's original question. I think we had to have some kind of comment during this presentation about the cost of all this and what that means. And then I'll tell you a little bit of history. We only have one French drain that goes under our rec room, and that was put in the late 90s. And we were there when that happened. And the comment we got from the city at the time, and I checked with the Regional Water Quality Board, is it was less than 500 gallons an hour. So they weren't going to bother with it. But that was before the new requirements of the NIPD's permit came along. Water Quality Control Board says you have to understand every discharge coming out of every drain pipe, rain event or not. And that's when they found the city all of a sudden said, oh yes, I remember Coronado Park has the ability through their pumps to pump. And so they came after us.
I'm just going to comment.
Thank you. Let's have a response, Steve.
I'm just going to comment and briefly, and then I'm going to hand the microphone to either of these other two gentlemen to talk about the cost issue. But I want to point out that Sandy is actually a subject matter expert on this, having been involved with the project from the earliest days. And he has probably forgotten more things than I'll ever know about that building. So he's been a very valuable resource. As to the permit, you bring up an interesting point, because at one point you were told since your volume was below a certain number, that it didn't really impact you. This permit changes every 5 years. The requirements for the permit change every 5 years. Everything about it changes every 5 years. And that's by design, so that as a variety of different circumstances change, the permit can change with the circumstances and continue to be efficacious for whatever it is we need it to be doing. So right now, they're talking about in this upcoming permit that there will be a carve out for anybody who discharges less than 15 out of any calendar quarter days. So 15 days of any, it's not really 90, because the calendar quarter isn't exactly 90 days. So there are still carve outs in there. They just don't apply to us at this particular point in time. But thank you for pointing out that permit is dynamic in its nature, and every 5 years it's a little bit different than it was before. Do either one of you gentlemen want to talk about the cost issue?
I'll initially talk to that. As soon as we understood the requirements that we were going to be facing and had some idea of what the costs were, we put out the disclosures. And I think the first disclosure was in 2020, and the second one was in 2021. And it basically said the same thing, and the estimate of the costs were and remain at this time that the treatment plant was going to cost about $500,000. And we won't know for sure until we actually get the bids back and see what it is. hopefully we won't be terribly surprised, but we never know. But in addition, we're going to have annual costs depending on the frequency of the testing, as Pete talked about before. And those tests can run from $5,000 to $15,000 a pop. And so depending if we have to do it every quarter or whether we can get some kind of dispensation and not have to do it so often will impact that operating cost. Plus, we have to operate this system, and operating that system requires maintenance, changing out filters and doing things of that nature. And in our disclosure, we said that could run somewhere in the area of $150,000 to $170,000 a year. So this is a significant impact on our budgets. So what's coming up? We have a budget meeting in November. That's when we do the 2023 budget. So we're going to have that budget meeting, and that's an open meeting. And we'll be talking about what kind of expenses we have in 2023 as opposed to what we did in 2022, et cetera, et cetera. And this will be on the table, this issue. And the other thing that we'll have to talk about is, do we need to have an assessment? And if so, how much? And that comes out of this whole process we're talking about here, the 2023 budget, and then what we get on the bids that will tell us how much it's going to cost. Anything else I should say?
Any further comment? Okay. The next question, Dick Mitchell.
Hi, my name's Dick Mitchell. I'm concerned, has anybody looked at who's caused the pollution? Why do we have this material that we've got to remove, and where does it come from?
Okay,
Because I think those people should have some responsibility.
those
Whoever they
people
are.
should have some responsibility. Who's putting this toxin in the ground, in the water? And that is a very, very difficult problem to solve, because groundwater moves all over. And for example, some of this chemical, maybe the TCE, is always associated with cleaning plants.
Right.
And we have one across the street, but if you'll notice, it's downhill from us. And water doesn't flow uphill. So, and I doubt they're putting it in the water, but they may be, but it's not coming back up our way. So this water is coming from the higher points of Coronado, which is up, I think around 4th and G, F and G, that's the high point on the island. And everything kind of slopes down from there. But then it's also the type of soil, whether it's going to come through that soil or go down. So all of these issues make that these chemicals might have been in this fill already. They might have already been here, because these were boat yards, these were all kinds of industrial areas before they were filled in. And when they dredge the bay, they fill in these areas, and then we get to develop it. So we have no idea. It might be here, it might coming from somewhere. Copper is all over the place. In particular, it runs down the street and from cars and all that kind of stuff. So it's very, very difficult to point to someone in particular and say, you're causing this, you're causing that problem, because we can't really tell.
Okay, we have a pause here.
Well, can I
We
add
have
just a little bit
at
to
least 3 more questions. This is, let me say this, we have plenty of time.
Let me just add a couple of things to that, because your question is a good one. And if you ever look at any of the places where people fish along the bay, you'll see that there are signs indicating that there are limits to the number of fish you should eat out of the bay in any given year, because the fish contain these contaminants. They contain the contaminants because the water in the bay contains the contaminants. One of the very first questions I ever asked a member of the Water Quality Control Board staff was this: if I am a child and I use a bucket to take water out of the bay, and then I pour that bucket of water back in the bay, am I a polluter? Because in my mind, this is very similar to what we're doing. Some of the water that comes in under our building is perk coming from the bay, and it's even got a salinity to it. And so when I asked that question to the Water Quality Control Board, their answer was very clear. Yes, if you pull water out of the bay in a bucket, the minute you have it in your possession, it's your water. And you can't return it to the bay unless you first treat it and bring it up to the correct standards before you put it back in. So to some extent, now this goes back to that fairness issue, right? I was also going to speak to something that Stephanie had said earlier that related to that. I have to apologize because the thought went straight out of my head.
It's a comment period that we have an opportunity to comment to the staff.
Yeah, no, I don't know that I was going to speak to that issue. We don't really know what that meeting is going to look like.
Right.
None of us have ever experienced an open meeting of the Water Quality Control Board. So I have no idea what their format is or how it works. I can tell you this, the rules that are being written into this permit are not locally written. These are rules that are coming down from on high. We were aware when we spoke to, is it Debbie Fawn from the Water Quality Control Board in our last meeting, that she was beginning to see some of the language for the regulations that were coming down that she would have to include into that permit. And for example, that 15 out of 90 days that I spoke about, that's not something that our local Water Quality Control Board is going to have control over. That's something that's coming from up above that they're having to incorporate into this new permit. So they're really, I don't know how much flexibility they even have with regards to allowing this or allowing that or making room for exceptions. So,
Yeah, well, you were right on as far as the history of this place. You know, the contaminants are on a film that's been contaminated for years and years. For me, I would think that would be an arguable point. I know with the city, the regional board certainly understands, you know, where that stuff, our film came from, what's been here before. And then my other comment is when we talk about costs, as you mentioned, there's regular maintenance costs. Who is going to be doing the maintenance, the checking, the testing, and completing, I'm assuming, written reports that may need to be submitted?
Who would like to respond to the question about who's going to do the checking and submit the reports?
So at this point, it'd probably be ALG unless we come up with somebody else that we might have to do it. But they're currently taking samples and they send them off to a lab. There are specific labs that do this testing, and there are different standards. We did one test some months ago. The water board said they wanted a different test, so we had to rerun the test to comply to the various standards that they have. I would like to loop back to Dick's question and also incorporate Stephanie to a certain extent. I believe you need to segment the permit from the mitigation, because we cannot discharge to the bay at all if we aren't on a permit. Being listed on the permit is a primary goal. In order to be listed, we have to have the capacity to treat and monitor that treatment. The mitigation efforts, I think, would be involved in trying to reduce the cost, and there are several. Do you mind if I can move to it? The first mitigation would be to attempt with the water board, and that would involve what we've talked about here, requesting that there be somewhat of a separate requirement for relatively low volume discharges. The current break on the old permits has been 100,000 gallons a day. over under, we're, 15% of that. So we would be significantly under, we could be discharging in a day, or we would be putting out in a week or 2 weeks and so forth. So the first thing would be, could we get some relief from that? And the issue that I have positioned with our environmental attorney is this, and I'll just read it off because I wrote it this last weekend. The first question is, in his experience, does it make sense to attempt that? They are not going to create a separate schedule. The question is, could they put in a footnote or say, hey, under X volume, we do something different? The issue is this: who does the request go to? Should we make the request to the board, or should we make it of the board staff? The second issue is, should it be written or oral? We have a monthly Zoom conference call with staff, which Pete sits in and I don't, or should it be a written request? And the third issue is, who does it come from? Do we do that ourselves? Should it come from ALG, the environmental consultant that we're using, or should we have the regulatory attorney write the request? Because it is so technical, and it's not political. This is not like a city council where if you got 1,000 voters, it has a huge impact because they're elected officials. This is a appointed regulatory board, which is interpreting rules. So they're not really subject to the normal types of political pressures. But if it could be positioned in the context of how the regulations are written, then I think it might have some traction. I could not write that.
Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath and pause. Would anyone else like to comment further? I've got some questions in the back, Jerry. Thank you. Do you have another question? Scott.
Hi.
You put so much time into it.
Jerry, the mic's back here.
This is a follow-up to the gentleman that had the question on the grant. I'm just curious whether or not we could get some assistance on the cost of this from one of the governmental agencies, either through the city council. They've got a budget. We've got EPA. We've got different government entities. Just wondering whether or not we could pursue that, whether we intend to pursue trying to get some assistance with helping us pay for this.
Okay, I see the president is taking copious notes of that question. Tom, would you care to respond?
Well, the answer to that is yes. And when I talk about the segmentation, hitting on the permit is where all the effort is been. The mitigation, the first effort would be with the water board. The second would be with the city. And one of the major issues with the city is, what are we asking for, and who do we want to ask, and how do we condition it? So one of the issues that has come up is, couldn't we put this water into the sewer in the dry season as opposed to the wet season because of the concern about it? The first issue that comes up there is there's a thing called a lateral, which is the pipe that goes from our building to the sewer, right? Because our pipes come down and this evidently goes this way. So somebody that knows construction would know they call that a lateral. Our lateral pipe handles all the waste that goes into the sewer system from the building. The volume that we put in there today is about equal to the volume we are pumping in groundwater. So what that says is, if we put this into the sewer system, we double our output. So the question is, can that pipe handle it? Because if it can't, it's coming into your unit. I mean, that's what happens. If it doesn't go through the pipe, it's coming back the other way. So before we start with, well, let's go to the city and say, okay, the city says, yeah, go ahead, put it in the sewer, which they haven't, have reasons for not doing it. We don't even know if we can do that. Now, I do know this. The sewer pipe is a 4-inch pipe. The storm drain pipe is a 6-inch pipe. Okay, I'm not enough of an engineer to do the calculation, but a 6-inch pipe is significantly larger than a 4, because because it's R squared pi, right? So it'd be 4 times 5 versus 3 times pi. I mean, it's 3 squared would be 9. It's a huge difference. So before we ask for the city to give us relief, that's one thing. The second is, are other people responsible? And the attorney we have, the regulatory, said, when you're listed on the permit, he said he can also help with finding other people that are responsible either for the contaminants or the volume that we may be able to pursue for some relief. That could get expensive. First of all, you have to document who it is and what they're doing. And then if they don't say, oh yeah, we'll pay, you'd have to sue them, which is an expensive process. So there are various efforts. The grant effort I hadn't thought of, but that's well worth considering.
Okay, Pete, do you care to add? No further? Okay, next question. Do we have? There we go.
I agree with the two people that say, I mean, this is kind of a ridiculous situation. And we're not responsible. And they're expecting a lot of money from us. And I know a lot of people can't afford it. And the cost of our condos, they can't resell because of this issue at the price they should get. So I think we really need to find some help to pay for this. They're asking us to put in a facility that normally would only be done by the city. It's a city government kind of thing that has a water plant. And I don't think that they can expect private individuals to do that. So I think that we need to look in, if we have to do this, then we've got to get some help somewhere. We cannot do this cost ourselves.
Okay, response, please. No response. Next question.
Okay, I'm still seeking clarification on about the permit, even though, is it, can you hear it? Okay. So we were told that American Plaza is on the original permit, correct? And so are they then, did they build a water treatment facility? Are they treating the water for the
Yes.
water discharge? Okay.
And had for 30 years.
Right, okay, so then, there was, you said, Tom, there was a lot of research done by the city to include us in the 1995 permit, and for whatever reason, this wasn't done. And so that the goal was to get on the permit, correct? Is to get on the
The
permit.
research.
So the cost is, so I wanna know what the cost is to get on the permit, because if that had been done by the city, then we wouldn't have to incur that cost, or maybe I'm interpreting this incorrectly. I mean, weren't we doing a lot of testing to be able to apply for the permit?
Yeah, I don't know that I could look at anybody, One America Plaza, the convention center, or Embassy Suites, and make any representation that somebody other than those entities paid for all of the processes that were required to get them on the permit and compliant with the permit. And I really don't think that even though time has passed, that the virtue of that particular time has passed would be an argument that we should have someone else pay for our processes involved with getting on the permit either. I'm
Well,
not.
I'm sorry,
sure
I
I
don't
can-
understand that. If you're saying that the city failed to put us on the permit for some reason that nobody knows about.
Well, what the city failed to do, if they failed to do anything, was they failed to identify us. Because once they identified us, it still would have been our responsibility to go through all that work. The city doesn't put us on the permit. The city would merely have been participatory in identifying us as a discharger that needed to be on the permit. So maybe what's going on here is it's a phrasing thing, because the city wouldn't have paid for us ever, not at the beginning, not in the middle, not in the end. And I don't believe the city of San Diego paid for One American Plaza, although they probably paid for the convention center because that's their project. And I don't think the city paid for the Embassy Suites either.
So there's no cost for trying to get a permit. But you're saying the city didn't put us on the permit.
No. The city has nothing to do with issuing the permit. Zero. The city's responsibility is to identify for the water board who is discharged. The fact that we discharge makes us responsible,
Okay.
regardless of where it comes from.
So it doesn't matter that we weren't grandfathered in at all.
Well, the difference would be, had we been grandfathered, we would have built this plant 25 years ago.
Okay.
And we would have been paying for the servicing of it and the testing for that entire period of time up until then.
Next question.
Is there anybody else that pumps groundwater like the landing, or are we the only ones that need to protect our foundation by doing that?
We've asked that particular question. We've been told that the landing does not discharge. But we're not in a position to be able to see who else in the Coronado city limits might be discharging. The city has indicated that there are no other permanent dischargers.
Permanent.
Keyword is permanent. Okay, Sandy, did you have another question? Or comment?
Yes, so historically, this was a shipyard next to us where the park is. And so that's where most of the contamination came from, especially copper bottom, paint, 50% copper. Paint the whole of the old days, not true anymore. And so that's where the copper contamination came from. The organic is questionable, but we went through a period in the 1960s and 70s when everybody was dropping it on the ground here in Coronado, including the Navy bases. The Navy has a bigger problem than we do, so don't worry about our trip. But that's where that comes from. Who owns it? We all own it. We are here now. We're part of the community. We inherited what our forebears did. And so we own the problem. So once we get the permit, once we build the facility and we're putting all this water away, I would talk to the city in the meantime and say, look, you have a problem with irrigation water, and this is irrigation acceptable water. Could we get some subsidy for running this operation and get the medium strip in the parks water? That grass doesn't care, it's slightly salty. And this would solve the city's problem, which is looming in the future. And it's a big one. And it's us being part of the community and contributing to it. And maybe we can decrease, the city can help decrease the operation costs.
Thank you, Sandy. Who would like to respond to that? Tom? Is it working?
That's what we hope. We know the city of Coronado, they made a decision not to build that water reclamation plan last year, but they're going to have to. They're going to absolutely have to. We would love to do that. We'd love to keep it and use it for irrigation. So it's too much water. We can't, it's too much. So if there was a water reclamation system, we'd be first in line to say, hey, sign us up. We'll be glad to go in there. And hopefully we get credit for that in some form or fashion. But we have another player involved, and that player is C.O.A. And C.O.A. owns all this water. Doesn't matter where it came from.
They own the contamination.
Yeah.
We're filtering,
Right,
which is a huge leverage point, and it's illegal.
yes.
Okay, yeah.
And so we need to.
He's saying that C.O.A. also owns the contamination that's in the water. So there are a lot of things out there in the future that we know we can see happening that might help mitigate our operational costs. But it doesn't stop us from being required to get the permit, get this thing in place, this water treatment plant, and start processing that water.
Okay, any further comment on that?
I would just add that, during this whole process, we've always been doing a lot of multitasking. As a different opportunity presents itself, for example, there was the discussion of the reclamation project for quite a while. And we did put a lot of effort into trying to get in touch with the right people to talk about participating in that reclamation project. because we felt that that would certainly help us reduce, the amount of water that we were putting out. We had a better use for the water in the long run anyways. I mean, we're taking fresh water and basically contaminating it with salt as soon as we put it into the bay, right? And that fresh water is a precious resource at this particular point. At other times, we were multitasking, running down this direction with the city of couldn't we put this water into the sewer? And so all along, while we've been efforting on getting this permit, we've also been efforting on these other directions as well as they present themselves. And unfortunately, one at a time, they've all been kind of eliminated, or at least their feasibility has been drawn into question. So we'll continue to do that. I'm certainly intrigued by the idea of trying to figure out whether or not there might be a source of funds in the form of a grant or something like that. It's not something I'm expert in, but it's certainly another avenue to be explored. But in the long run, we have a problem. And that problem is a deadline that's looming that we have no control over, and that's this permit issuance. And so we have to continue efforting along this primary path of creating this treatment plant and getting in compliance with that permit, being prepared to be joined onto that permit. And we have no choice about that. We can also continue to look at other things, perhaps finding a different source of funds, or the reclamation issue might come up again. There's any number of variety of things that could happen here. And I think we're always willing to look at any particular option.
Thank you. Next question.
What is the impact if you don't comply?
Daily times.
The process is the water board would issue a permit. We would put in an application to be included, which is after. They would review that, and if we qualify, they would issue a notice of applicability. We have 100 days after that's issued to comply. Clean Water Act fines are $37,500 a day maximum. They rarely assess the maximum. And the good news is the statute runs 5 years, so they can't assess any more than 5 years.
Okay.
Well, most of those are negotiated down, by the way. But, they had a big club.
I would add to that at this particular point, nobody's talking about issuing any fines to us at all.
Right.
Because of this kind of understanding that we're working towards compliance. But if we were to dig our heels in and stop working towards compliance, that is a possibility. They could actually come after us for fines for being in violation. So I don't really think we want to test that water.
I believe we have another question.
Thank you. You mentioned 7 to 10 gallons per minute, 14,400 per day. Wasn't there a time period where, was it the city who was measuring our water volume? Didn't they make a huge error? And are they really familiar that, yeah, they made this error, and did they correct it in their papers?
Well, that also is a good question. And that estimate comes from the period of time back in around 2015. And the way they made that estimate was that they were watching the water coming out of the outfall and measuring that, which was more than just our water. And it was more than just the water that we pump. Because as I think Tom mentioned earlier, this really comes down to the water that we pump that's a problem. But we have irrigation water that comes out of out of that discharge, right? Or out of that pipe. There's water from Centennial Park that comes out of that pipe. There's water from Orange Avenue that comes out of that pipe. There's a lot of different sources of the water that comes out of that pipe. So their estimate was really inaccurate. They know that it was inaccurate. And we have done a lot of work to prove to them with testing and actually putting flow meters on each particular pump that we have, so that we can really narrow this down to the water that we pump. Not all the rest of the water, just the water in question that's a problem. So that's how we came to that 7 to 10 gallons a day.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Okay, we're going to take a deep breath. I'm going to walk to the back of the room for another question. Thank you.
submitted a question about cost of this project, and I did not see an answer to it, and Pete just mentioned it about all the expensive testing. I wanted to know how much money has been spent so far on this project, the testing, the engineering costs and so forth. A couple months ago, I think you had mentioned it was in excess of $100,000. So I was wondering what the costs have been to date. Additionally, last year, the board approved, I believe, the highest HOA fee allowed, which was 20%. And I wanted to know what amount of our monthly fees are going into an account for the water treatment facility. I did not get an answer to that. And also, I understand that the budget meeting is now in November, but have there been discussions about another exorbitant HOA increase for the ongoing running costs?
We have had no discussions regarding anything having to do with the 2023 budget at this point. We're preparing for that, but no. If it wasn't mentioned at the board meeting, we haven't had any such discussion. I don't believe we talked about it at all at the board meeting. What we're going to do at this board meeting tomorrow is set a date in November to be ready for that. The other questions that you're asking, I'm not sure I have a good idea of what that number is that we may have. In other words, what we've spent this year to this group of consultants.
No, last year too, to date. I wanted to know today.
So let me take that as an action item, and we'll try to have that at the board meeting tomorrow, have an answer.
That would be
Because
great.
we're going to be talking about, our monthlies and so on, and here's our treasurer, and he's going to possibly be able to come up with that definitive, because it's not that easy to tease out all this stuff, but we'll give it a shot.
Well,
I
no,
believe
so
she
my
also
other
asked
question,
a question
Yes.
about, has any money gone into special account or reserves other than what's been spent as a part of our dues increase?
Correct, and I think we're going to talk about that tomorrow as well. Yes, the intent was, and we do have a line item in there for water treatment. So we'll talk about where we are in.
so there's a certain amount every month going into that line item. Is that correct?
I can't hear you.
Okay, time out.
Is there a certain amount going in every month for that line item? So the answer is yes.
Well, yes. Yes. That was the intent, to build up, so we would have some idea. We could build up ahead of time to lessen the amount that we may have to assess in 23.
Okay, now, everybody's taking a deep breath. We don't want to leave anyone feeling like they didn't get a chance to participate. Philip, it's all yours. Oh, we got a question. Oh, I'm sorry. It's all right, keep going.
Just one more question. This meeting, which I appreciate, is being recorded. Are we going to put it somewhere, the recording somewhere, so folks who weren't able to watch it today can watch it? And how do they access it? And do we want to give access only to our homeowners with a special code or something? How open is this going to be to the rest of the public? Do we want the rest of the public to know about all these ins and outs?
I'm gonna take the mic and answer that. I just made eye contact with Nick Burmeister, and probably 30 minutes after we adjourn, Philip and I will receive an email from him, which is a link to this meeting, correct? Now, what Philip does with it, I would imagine he'll make it available to our owners. Yeah, just a matter of record. Since the library is going to put the recording of this meeting in their YouTube and Facebook pages, the public, if they want to, can go to the library and download and watch this meeting. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, any more?
Concerns with that.
Okay,
You
Are we
have-
good?
You're saying you have some concerns with that?
Do we want to expose these questions, these concerns to the public?
The question is, do we want to expose this meeting to the public? This was an open meeting. If people had come in here, as far as I was concerned, they could have come in and sat down and listened to the whole thing. So it wasn't our intent to not make it public.
This meeting was listed on the library's schedule of events. Or, oh, another question, here we go. Or is it a comment?
Well, it's kind of a question because if we put this out to the public, and here's the question, if they realize what it's gonna cost to move into CP, what is that going to do to any of the people that live there who want to sell? And do realtors in the city know anything about these upcoming costs that would be attached?
These, I'll let Pete, but remember, we put out disclosures and these numbers are in the disclosures we've already put out. And these disclosures are.
Yeah, are what? There are disclosures, and these disclosures are given to prospective buyers. So they have that information before they, make a final decision on purchasing. So they have the ability to do what they need to do. In the case of the most recent sale that came up, which was George Seal's place, I had very specific conversations with the realtor ahead of time, made sure that the realtor was aware of that among other things, and made sure that she had a copy of the disclosure so that she could adequately inform her buyers. So we do what we can to make sure that they have an opportunity to let that be part of their decision-making process. So holding that information back wouldn't necessarily change that, because we do make sure that buyers get that information. So.
Okay, we're winding down, and we have another, no, that's okay.
I understand what you're saying about disclosure for the buyers, and I definitely think we should disclose this information to any prospective buyer. And I just wish we had been afforded that same information, because we would not have purchased our property. And I understand that this was known back in 2016 or whatever, and we should have been given information about this. So I just want to make that statement.
Well, and I certainly understand the way you feel. I think Tom expressed this earlier, but I'll say this again. This has really been a process of coming to an understanding of what it meant. And at the beginning, we didn't really understand what it meant with regards to having to build a treatment plant, or having to process the water, or having ongoing requirements for testing.
Okay, I'm gonna
I was just pausing and waiting for Pam, since it was her question, to listen while I gave the response. So the issue is that once we came to an understanding of what the costs would be associated with this, I think that we immediately moved toward making the disclosures. Prior to that time, we didn't really understand what those costs and issues might be.
sleeping dog awakened. Any further questions? This has been a great meeting. Thank you very much. And here we go.
I'll just say a few words in closing. I want to thank you all for attending, and also the people online that we had. Special thanks to the library and the library staff and Nick for sending all this out, and causing my hair to go gray. We talked about the video recording. I'm sure there's going to be some fallout and other questions and so on. Please email those into management or me, those questions. I like them in writing. And remember, at our meetings, you can only comment in the comment period, and that's really not a good time to make a big, long question or technical stuff, because we won't respond at the meeting. But if you send us these in writing, we can fold it in sometime what we're talking about in the meeting, just because we know that's a particular issue, and you brought one up that, for example, on the funds that we'll try to get to at the next meeting. So if there are no further questions, I move to close this board meeting. Do I hear a second?
Oh, yeah.
All in favor, say, hey. By close. Thank